Over the last several classes, we've been building two things at the same time: practical skills for using LLMs and a mental model of how they work. So we've covered some prompting techniques, some context management. We've talked about shaping outputs. We're not talking about using magic words, but of steering probabilistic systems. Every prompt is basically you shape the probability of what comes next by giving it better model context, tighter constraints, clean examples, a more defined workflow, and a more defined target. We also zoomed out last week to look at broader frontier model landscapes so you'd know what models are available. But now it becomes a confusing mix between what you want to do and what models can do what you want to do. So in this video, what I want to cover is some of the platform capabilities and modes that you can explore. And I've got a mapping here to show what's available on paid versions and what's available on free versions. So keep in mind, you can download free versions of all these frontier models and give it a go and play around with different things. But to do that, you would need to know what you're trying to do and whether that particular model can do that functionality. In this graphic, I wanted to also talk about there's a way to play around with this on your own and to make this more accessible in case you have trouble distinguishing colors. You can actually move this into blue, orange, gray mode, or the natural inclination is to do green, yellow, red. This is fully available on the model for green. It's partially available for yellow, and red for unavailable. Okay, so let's go through the categories so that you can get a mental model of what you might want to try to do. We've talked about several of these things like reasoning and thinking modes. We talked about how you might want just a fast response or you might want it to think deeper. So this mapping tells you, if you mouse over, it tells you more details about how to prompt deep thinking modes or reasoning modes versus faster responses. Okay, so you can use the graphic for that. Another thing we haven't talked much about is a lot of the frontier models have a deep research feature. So it acts like a research agent. It goes, searches the web, looks for resources. You might want to try that. I haven't had a lot of luck with that because I think you have to have some pretty good prompting skills or else you just get too much information all at once. But again, I haven't had a lot of use cases for that I've found, but it's something that you might want to play around with. Do some deep researches on a topic and see what comes out of that. We've talked about tools that are embedded within the frontier models. A common one is web search. And so this just kind of gives the details on how web search happens. And, you can see they're fully implemented on ChatGPT for both the free model and the paid model. But on Claude, for example, there's some limitations on web searches compared to the paid model. So you can look at this matrix and tell those kind of things. We've talked about memory and personalization. This tells you, how this stacks out for free versus paid. So with ChatGPT, it's partially implemented. If you have a free version, there's a full version of memory if it's paid for. And you can go through that and take a look at the options. Sometimes you might want to use the voice interface. I'm not a big fan of the voice interface just because I'm just not comfortable doing it. But a lot of people like it. And so you can directly talk to these frontier models. And this shows how this plays out. It's limited for the free version on ChatGPT, on a Claude. But, you can, on most of it looks like it's multimodal stuff is limited. But I feel like multimodal is an important use case, especially feeding images into it and generating things in that way. Image generation, we all like to play around with those. Gemini is in particular very good at that. And so this has a mapping on what you get from the free versions versus the paid versions. Another thing that we've talked about briefly was the way that you can use a frontier model to do fine-grained edits. So you might get something from a prompt and then put it into the canvas mode or put it into a Word file if you're using Copilot. And from there, you can actually do more edits using highlight a section and ask ChatGPT or Copilot to reword a particular paragraph. So this shows how that stacks up across the models, what's available for free versions and paid versions. For those of you who like to write code, you might want to check out the code execution capabilities and the sandbox capabilities. Sandboxing just means you're not having to run this on your own machine where you have to worry about installing libraries and the things that it might do locally to your machine. We haven't talked a lot about agents and tasks yet, but this is something you can explore, and this shows the layout on what's free. Well, on the ChatGPT, that's not on the free tier. In fact, on most of them, it's not on the free tier to do agents. Okay. Custom assistants and personas. You can do a custom GPT, I think, on even the free versions of ChatGPT. And in Gemini, these are called gems. And on Copilot, I haven't played around with this, but apparently it's called Agent Builder. So you might see a tab in the upper left-hand corner on ChatGPT, for example, where you can build a custom GPT. So if you were going to do something with a large language model that was pretty repetitive and you wanted to do it a lot of times during a session, or even it's part of your workflow that you do across days and months, you might have a custom GPT set up to do some specialized things. We can talk about this in class because it's a useful feature. Another thing that you might be aware of, but you might not, because it's not super useful in my opinion yet. A lot of these models have a dedicated browser. Like in ChatGPT, there's an Atlas feature where you can actually do some prompting and it will actually run a browser. You can see it working with your browser. The use case that people often talk about is, help me book a flight. And yeah, you can see it take over your mouse and click and go to travel sites and punch on some buttons. But in my opinion, so far, I haven't seen it where it's super useful, and I don't really trust it, but it's something fun to play with. File creation and export is something we've talked about as well. This is something I'm a big believer in because it's hard to get large language models to do things unless you can create files and export them and actually do productive work without doing a lot of cutting and pasting. It really levels up your skills if you can figure out how to export things. And so this is the mapping that shows you what you can do with the various models, like ChatGPT, lots of different options, Word files, PDFs, Markdown, spreadsheets, PowerPoints, these kind of things. Across the models, there's different features of this, like with the Google, you're stuck in the Google ecosystem. That's, to me, one of the disadvantages of Gemini, but I suppose if I was heavily embedded in the Google ecosystem, I wouldn't view that as a disadvantage. It's integrated right in. So I'll let you be the judge for how that would play out for you. I was surprised to see Grok did not have file exports. And, I included some other models in this graphic like DeepSeek and Perplexity, so you can compare and see what you might want to play around with. Okay, an up and coming thing I think is going to be local file system access. Most of the models right now do not allow you to do that, but we're seeing some sandbox cases in ChatGPT where it actually is going to make a little local machine virtually to let you do some file system access, or it might even let you do it directly on your machine. So I think this is coming, and this is part of what we're seeing with the Codex UI. It's not really part of direct ChatGPT, but coming out of the OpenAI lab. Okay, with Claude does have a setup where you can actually do local file system access, and we're going to explore that more in the course. But all the other models, there's limited support and nothing on the free versions. Okay, so hopefully this helps you navigate the landscape of features across the different frontier models. This graphic is more useful if you're just using it as an information resource, like, oh, I want to play around with the canvas and editing a document. What models will let me do that? On the free version, ChatGPT will let you do that a little bit. It's got a limited access for that. On Copilot, I feel like, we have more than the free version, but somehow I feel like we're less than the full version. I'm not exactly sure how Copilot stacks out, but we talked about in class how you can take a prompt coming out of Copilot and put it into Microsoft Word, for example, and then use Copilot again within Microsoft Word for edits. That's a pretty strong use case. Okay, anyway, I hope you find this useful. We'll talk more about this as we go through the course.